So, recording in progress. This time around, I found the record button a lot faster than I did last time around. So, and most possibly, you're also going to hear some difference in the audio because I've really invested in some fancy schmancy hardware here. But, Andy, how's everything going?
Everything is fine with me. I'm having a great day. Hopped up on some great meetings, great articles, and some looking forward to some really cool workshops.
Awesome. And I mean, the whole idea behind this is obviously is just jump into the subject at hand. I think we made
Absolutely.
some pretty relevant introductions last time around, and obviously everybody who's listening and subscribing has a perfect idea who we are. So I think a quick introduction might be a good idea, though. Andy, give me a quick rundown. What do you do?
My name is Andi Kravlich. I'm a future strategist working for the Swedish public sector and currently working for the municipality of Huddinge and have worked in several municipalities before. I work with, innovation management, analysis, future scoping, all that stuff. What is a city? What is a municipality? What is it supposed to be? What's it going to be like in 2030? And what needs do we need to meet? That's my purview.
Nice. I mean, I've always been impressed by your CV in general, but every time I hear it, I think it's just as impressive. I'm going to try and hang with you as usual. And I work as an entrepreneur. I run a company out of Stockholm, Sweden, which is called Mestro. We do a lot of energy analysis on big property portfolios. We just got listed, actually. I'm pretty proud of that. And on top of that, I invest in startups, help them grow, and I do quite a bit of public speaking, talking about the match made in heaven, that is sustainability and business. And that comes from my past of being a Greenpeace activist 20 years ago and also working as a sustainability director. So yeah, a fairly good mix. And I think we've got some interesting perspectives kind of in between the both of us. But you had a pretty good idea of what topic we should cover today, Andy. So can you set the scene?
Well, right. This has to do with two things. Number one, I saw a really great documentary about fast fashion, which of course brings up the whole idea of the fashion industry and always wanting the latest thing. And the shirt from a year ago is uselessly out of date, even though it's still perfectly good. And the things that are wrong with that from a sustainability perspective. The other was a radio documentary, a podcast I heard about, General Motors and Ford, and the invention of planned obsolescence by basically Harley Earl in the 1950s, who wanted people to buy the latest Chevrolet, even though they had the Chevrolet from 2 years ago. So how do we do that? Well, we do that by planning product cycles and life cycles. And this is the first time that this kind of enters the kind of business where everyday people feel the effects of it. And we're basically still living in the world which that created. And I started thinking about the music industry as well, which I'm part of, and the fact that this amplifier by my ear over here is a Soldano amplifier that the basic design of which hasn't changed since 1987. That's when this amp came out, and if you buy one today, it's still the same. And if you compare that to the tech sector, where a telephone, from a smartphone from a year ago is something completely different from a smartphone that comes out next year. Well, that kind of got me thinking, do long product life cycles stunt innovation and growth? Can we combine them with sustainability? What about the right to repair? What about, and these thoughts just started exploding in my head. And I figured I got to have a chat with my friend Gus about this.
I mean, it's really interesting, especially out of a sustainability perspective. And there's a lot to unpack, obviously, but I just got to give you my first kind of thought on this. And that is, I remember seeing the Steve Jobs commencement speech at Stanford. I think it was 2005, something like that. Go check it up on YouTube. It's an awesome speech, unless you haven't already seen it. But he says that death is life's change agent. And I think it's so horribly true if you're a living person, but it's also very true for products in general. I mean, in order for something to evolve, the previous generation of whatever it was needs to die. I mean, that's just the way it is. If you want to make something better, obviously better is going to trump whatever came before it. So taking that back to the amp you've got behind you, I mean, can you buy a better amp today? I mean, or is that just, the design, is it just timeless? Is it just, perfected back in 1987?
Right. And that's very valid, because some sectors of technology are still growing. You're still discovering new feature sets, whereas others are basically set. A tube amplifier, or as the British say, a valve amplifier, is basically the same circuit topology today that it was in the 1950s and the 1960s. And the only difference really is how you voice it and what components you use, but the basic technology has remained the same. Now, of course, you have a lot of digital sound equipment, and that follows the fast fashions of the tech industry. So if you buy like a digital effect modeler or something, which is 3 or 4 years old, you start see people on forums going like, should I still buy this? Is it still okay to buy this in 2022? Whereas nobody's asking that about a tube amp, because those have been the same since the 1960s. And if you buy one today, you'll still be using it in 40 years time. So there is a big difference there.
And it's interesting because I'm working in obviously I run a tech company, and I don't only run a tech company, it's also a SaaS company or SaaS company. And SaaS stands for software as a service, where we basically give our customers access to our software for an annual fee, and that's the way it works. They stop paying, we stop supplying the service. It doesn't really work like that with an amp back from 1987, and I think the whole idea behind having things as a service, whether it's your Spotify playlists or your software or even your car, it's kind of a trend in the same direction, where you basically think that, okay, how can I get this customer hooked for life? And first you sell something that is really, really good. Qualities can outlast you forever. You buy a piece of clothing back in, 100 years ago, or probably didn't buy it then, back then probably had it sewn. Then it could last you a lifetime. And obviously, if you're a company working with selling, immense volumes of clothing, you're not interested in having customers having them last a lifetime, so you make the product cycles shorter. And then on top of that then comes the whole subscription model, where you actually hook customers even further. But I think the cool thing with a subscription model over a buy model is that with a subscription model, you don't necessarily have to have the consumerism. You can actually take that portion out. And that makes a big difference, because usually when I talk to people about sustainability, they usually tell me capitalism has failed and capitalism is wrong or whatever. And I fundamentally disagree. Capitalism is alive and kicking, but consumerism, that's where we have a problem. So if we can keep the capitalism and kind of take the consumerism out, we're at a really interesting place, because then you'd have brands that value quality and repairability, right to repair, over the short life cycle. And I think that's a really interesting place to go, because it also gives you that as a subscription model, because then you can actually have a customer subscribe to whatever product that you're supplying, and you can have them, pay continuously, as in if it was a short life cycle, but you also get the possibility of repairing and things. So I think the whole access thing unlocks a lot of the potential in capitalism, without taking with the dangers of consumerism that we're seeing all across the world today.
I do agree with you in principle, but I'd like to pose a problem in this discussion. I think most of the people who will be watching or listening to this will recognize the S-curve model of development, where you have one generation of equipment or solution, which basically starts developing very slowly, and then it reaches some sort of steady state of feature set inflation, and then it reaches a point of inflection, and it starts running out of steam because you've optimized everything for it. And then of course it's time for the next generation, the next S, to start with its and the whole generational idea of product development and innovation is governed by these S-curves. You could argue that a long product life cycle also prolongs the generational lifespan of a particular type of solution, and that makes it more difficult for the next level of solution to reach any kind of traction. So if cars lasted 200 years after you bought them, we would have a lot harder of a time electrifying the car fleet than they do if they last 10 to 15 years, because 10 to 15 years later, people are going to have to buy a new car. But if cars last forever, what do we do about it? So how do we marry the kind of S-curve generational need to innovate and so on with the need for longer life cycles without stunting growth? I'm not expecting you to answer definitely, but it's a discussion I'd like to have.
Well, I'll come with the answer now. And the
Exactly.
answer is 42. What is it? The Hitchhiker's Guide to the
Yes.
Galaxy. I think this is interesting because to me, I just have to go back to myself. I mean, I'm a sustainability geek, but I do love innovation. And for example, you can see this abundantly clear in all the tech that I use. I'm a die-hard Apple fan, so I use a lot of Apple tech. So I've got pretty much every piece of hardware that Apple produces currently. I've got it somewhere around my house. And wherever I go in the world, my wife actually thinks that I've got some sort of a built-in GPS to locate an Apple store. And even though it is, kind of a global, inventory that they carry, I still go into an Apple store fully expecting to find something that I haven't seen before. So you can obviously see how hooked I am on Apple products. And I really, when it comes to iPhones, I do like to upgrade because I do think that, cameras get better, feature sets get better, all these things get better. So the whole thing is, okay, if you subscribe to the idea of that innovation is a good thing, which you do, the whole S-curve thing needs to be combined with some sort of a cyclability. And of course, that in cars, it comes to the fact that according to European Union law, a car needs to be 98% recyclable today. And I mean, that's very high recyclability. And the idea then is, of course, to say that, okay, the old phone or the old car or the old whatever gets turned into something new. And when it comes to cars, that's easy enough. I mean, you can separate cars into, not that many components. When it comes to clothing, it sounds so much easier than it is. Circling back to the fast fashion thing, because I mean, if you just, look at whatever clothing you have on, I'm not asking you to take off your shirt, or am I? That would boost viewership, wouldn't it? You're going to see that the sweater you're wearing or whatever the garments you're wearing are usually Frankenstein together of a bunch of different kind of fabrics, and getting those kind of sorted and reused is a major problem today. Major problem. So in some sectors, recyclability and repairs a lot easier than it is in others.
Absolutely. And of course, the same goes for electronics. I mean, we don't really think twice about when our phones encapsulate their entire PCB in gunk because they want to make it waterproof or whatever. I mean, that makes it a lot more difficult to recycle electronic components than it used to be. But of course, we do need this driving force to drive technology forward. I'm thinking of a story. Bill Gates and Paul Allen wrote an operating system for a computer kit called the Altair, and it was a basic operating system which they wrote, and they got it licensed to Altair. And Altair basically said that, once you reach $150,000 of license fees, ownership goes to Altair, and then we own the operating system. And both Bill and Paul were like, we're absolutely fine with that, because they knew that by the time they reach $150,000 of revenue, the Altair computer is going to be completely superseded by something else.
Yeah.
So they saw, the business model differently than the people who were in charge of the company, who saw a longer life cycle.
Yeah.
And I wonder if the move to longer life cycles and the right to repair is going to lead to similar interesting situations where certain companies understand the new, framework and other companies do not, and whether that's going to open the field for new players, just like Microsoft, to take new roles in value networks because they see it coming.
I mean, obviously it is. And now I'm going to sound like a broken record here because I keep circling back to sustainability. But I think one thing that I usually tell companies when they seek advice to me about sustainability, I say that one of the problems you have with these, giants, big companies that have been around for 50, 60, 70 years, they've usually been around for that period of time for a reason, and that's because they've had a lot of time to perfect the way they solve the basic problem that they solve. But that, the solution or the problem that they're solving is, fundamentally rooted in when the company was founded 50, 60, 70 years ago. And there's a really good TED talk by, I'm gonna remember who it is pretty soon, but there's a pretty good TED talk about this where the TED speaker says that there's a fundamental disconnect between innovation and size. So the bigger you are, the less prone you are to innovation, and sustainability is fundamentally an innovative discipline. You need to be able to innovate to be able to be, sustainable, which means that sustainability is going to be one of those feature sets that companies need to pick up as a part of their innovation strategy. And unless they're capable of doing so, they're going to fall victims to, a paradigm shift. Because, obviously, we all know this, that whenever there is a paradigm shift, the existing players have a tendency to not being, capable of sticking around beyond that paradigm shift, just because they're usually too invested in whatever problem that they're being set up to solve. So having a small company and being able to start a company and solve a problem that is rooted in today rather than, half a millennia ago or half a century ago means that I think you're in a fundamentally better place to grow and really reach that S-curve status.
And in your role as a venture capitalist, do you look for these qualities in businesses? I mean, what is your nerve system for looking for that?
I think, and this is the fun thing with anybody that's investing. I mean, you think you can pick out the winners of tomorrow by just looking at business models, and you can't. I mean, in the end, it's funny. If I look at the companies that I've had a look at that I've said there's no way that this company is going to make it, and they've grown to be really, really big. I mean, there's quite a few. So, I wish I could invest retroactively, but I can't. And
we all do.
Yeah, we'll have to come up with a
sell
product,
you some shares in a fruit company.
Please do. I want some Apple shares. Anyways, I think what becomes important at that point is looking at the team that's running the company and the possibility of the tech. Sure, the tech component or the product, if it's not a tech component, the product itself is interesting. And basically, the idea behind investing in high-risk startups is that you want to have an idea of, let me rephrase that. You want to apply your own analysis of the future onto that company, and obviously invest in companies that have the possibility to make that future better. And obviously that's where you're going to find your returns. So essentially, anybody working in venture capital is, they're looking for trends, and they're really interested in finding, people, and they're interested in finding trends. And obviously that makes speaking and venture capitalism a pretty good, kind of marriage, because speaking is essentially the same. You're selling your version of the future to whomever's listening. So, but throwing that question right back at you, if you're looking at municipalities and we're talking S-curves and innovation curves, is it just me being somewhat judgmental in thinking that municipalities or the public sector move slower than the private sector?
I think there's a misunderstanding of sorts when it comes to scale and size. And it's easy to see a municipality which serves, like for instance, the one I work in serves 116,000 residents, and we have just shy of 7,000 employees. It's easy to see that as a big business because 7,000 employees it's a pretty sizable company. But this is a conglomerate, not a company. This is a loosely held conglomerate of people who do everything from strategic city planning to, having a backpack and going out and ensuring geographical measurements of measure points in the geospace and so on. So it is everything in between. And I think the critical mass for every individual part of that organization is small enough to contain truly innovative ideas. I think also that the public sector has an impetus to innovate, which isn't always there in the private sector. And we talked about this last time. It is one of the few places in the world where you can find increased demand described as a threat in a SWOT analysis rather than a possibility, because we can't scale up our wallet when demand for our services increases. And this, of course, gives us a built-in impetus to always question our methods and to always look at, is this really the best way to provide this service? Because we can't pass the buck on to the consumer. We have to absorb that cost.
Yeah.
So I think cities have the potential to be truly innovative, but I think they suffer from a scalability problem because the innovative solution in one fingertip of this big conglomerate has a very low probability of spreading out throughout the entire conglomerate because the business models and the core businesses and the core competences are so vastly different. So the question I would say isn't can municipalities innovate? It's can preschools innovate? or for instance.
Can they? I mean, usually or let me rephrase that. Which would you say in general are the most innovative parts of this conglomerate? And let me pose you this second question. Are they thinking life cycle analysis? Are they thinking SCurves? Are they thinking, okay, how can I make this service better or possibly kill it in order for something else to take its place that will provide a better service for the people that are using it?
Okay, so I have three answers for you here, and they're different. There are three different answers. There's the honest answer, there's the obvious answer, and there's the creative answer. So we'll start with the creative one because I like that. I'd love to be chief creative officer someday. The creative answer is teachers, because teachers govern their own classroom, and they are free to try all sorts of interesting, innovative solutions. There's so much going on in ed tech right now, and just, testing out. If you have two classes, it's easy to test something in one and not the other. You can design your own experimentation methodology. Teachers are some of the most innovative people out there. The obvious answer is geographical information. All these, the people who are handling that, because they have the tech savvy, they have the data scientists, they have the big picture, when it comes to open data, Internet of Things, and so on. That's the obvious answer. And I think the honest answer, it is the vendors of the technological solutions which innovate for many municipalities, because they will, I think in a lot of cases, the innovation process starts with a manager that goes to an expo and sees a product and then sells the adoption of that product as innovation. Whereas in actual fact, it's just procurement.
Well, that is sales in itself, isn't it? Being able to sell something off as being more innovative than it is. And I think that's, partially a lot of companies do that really well, don't they? But I think the cool thing that I come back to when it comes to possibly me being judgmental about municipalities is the idea that the cost of failure for innovation for small companies is incredibly low. The cost of not innovating is incredibly high because you're not going to stick around. Because if you compete with a big company on the same terms as the big company, you're going to fail every time because you've got everything stacked against you. So you need to innovate and
symmetrical warfare. Yeah.
There you go. I mean, you need to flip the tables. You need to be different. You need to do something different. Otherwise, you're just going to die. So that means that the cost of failure is quite low because you're a small company. You don't have a lot of people on payroll. It's just the cost of failure is generally quite low. The cost of not innovating is generally very high. When it comes to municipalities, I would say that the cost of failure is quite high because you've got constituents that don't want to see the taxpayer money being wasted on these weird things that might not turn out to be something. I mean, I remember reading an article about, I think it was a camel farm that was being started outside of Gothenburg. And it's being generally laughed at. And maybe it deserves to be laughed at, what do I know? But I think the idea is that you don't want to see these failed kind of interesting things. You just want to see steady state, good development. You don't want your taxpayer money to be squandered on something that is irrelevant. And I think for me, that kind of makes the two businesses or the two entities fundamentally different, but the need is still the same, because obviously if society changes, everybody's going to need to change with it, innovative or not. And if you're incredibly uninnovative, even small change is going to hurt so much and is going to be perceived as its own S-curve, even though it's in miniature. So I think it's interesting how you kind of do that, and that's why I think you're such an interesting person to me. Is because you're really embodying this whole idea of how do we turn something that has change kind of stacked against it into something that is truly innovative. Because just to round this rant off, it is that there's the cool thing that you told me once about municipalities, the idea that it is a conglomerate. I mean, imagine a company doing the width of things that a municipality is doing. Would that company truly be innovative at that point, or would it also encounter a lot of the same problems? And obviously it would. So, I mean, it's difficult to make a fair comparison between a municipality or an organization that is governmental or a privately owned business.
Absolutely. And let me just, round that off by telling you my perspective on change. And I want to mirror exactly what you're saying. I've heard some very senior decision makers, former prime ministers of this country, in conferences that have just, said, you're never allowed to fail with taxpayer money.
Yeah.
That's the approach to innovation. And when this guy was asked, what do you think about, celebrating failure and everything, and he just looked really concerned and said, "You're never allowed to fail the taxpayer money." And with that attitude, you're not going to get very far. But I think the problem is a lot of the times when we're talking about failure, we're not actually describing failure. We're describing the experimental state of arriving at our goal. And I usually explain this with the parallel parking, parallel, where you start parallel exactly. You start parallel parking, and you don't have a plan for exactly what you're going to do at any given time. You have a goal state in mind. And that's parking in the spot. And there are two fail states. The first one is not fitting in the spot and not being able to park in it. The other one is damaging your car while you're doing it. And our perspective on failure in municipalities is often, when we have to change gear, it's seen as a failure. When we have to turn the wheel, it's seen as a failure because we have to change course and we have to back paddle and we have to say, well, we thought this was a solution and now it's turned out that it isn't. So we're going to go this way instead. And to me, those are not fail states. That's not missing your goal of providing good service for the citizen. Those are necessary parts of parking your car. You can't parallel park without changing gear and without turning the wheel. And I think getting to the understanding that these are necessary components of development is where municipalities maybe have a ways to go.
But I think, and to cut municipalities some slack here, is that I think this is it's very eloquently put, and I think it describes a lot of people, because even with startups, you see a lot of people thinking that you're going to succeed with a startup in one smooth motion. I have a business plan, and then I'm going to carry that business plan out, and then I'm going to become successful. And usually I quote Mike Tyson, and I think it is actually him quoting somebody else, or he's paraphrasing, but I like the Mike Tyson quote best, and that is that everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And that is so true when it comes to startups. And that's why when I talk to people that are telling me, okay, I'm making a business plan, I say, for God's sakes, don't. Don't do a business plan, because the only thing I know is that business plan is not going to survive first contact with the enemy. I mean, it isn't. So you should.
I usually say that plans are the latest misunderstanding of what's going to happen.
That's awesome. And it's so true. It really is so true. I mean, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't plan in itself, because it's good to have an idea where you go forwards. But you should plan with the idea that you know that it's not going to be 100% accurate. And that goes back to your parallel parking analogy, because it isn't a smooth motion to start a company either. I mean, you're going to meet so many failures. You're going to get punched in the mouth so much. And the whole idea behind successful entrepreneurs is usually resilience. The idea of them accepting that failure is not failure, it's just another way of learning of how to do this the right way, or actually correcting my course so I can reach that successful end state of being parallelly parked. But carrying this over to big companies with short life cycles, because there's one thing I really want to touch on, and that is how you can kind of move forwards with this. And you can look at really big, look at H&M, which is a big Swedish, fashion giant across the world. Obviously, everybody that listens knows H&M. And they've taken an approach that is quite interesting. And they kind of make you, or they give you the possibility of giving clothes back so they can be recycled one way or another. And they have a really interesting collaboration with a Swedish startup called RenewCell, where they try and basically compost clothes, for the lack of a better word. So the general idea here is that you're capable of, through a quite advanced process, making sure that clothes is compostable and then returned into a new kind of a fabric that is not virgin, but that's recycled, and that can go back in, and that you can make new clothes out of. And that general idea is H&M thinking, let's continue using the same business model, and then let's use tech or innovation to kind of make that business model not become obsolete. And
interesting.
I love that idea, Even though
Absolutely.
there are so many people that are obviously skeptical because we haven't seen this being capable. We haven't seen this being done at scale yet, but we're seeing, you know, quite large quantities being capable of being renewed through renew cell. But then we've got other companies saying that it's so far fetched and it's so far forward that it's basically a red herring that's preventing us from changing the fundamental problem with the short life cycle, and we need to basically just prolong the life cycles themselves. Because when it comes to clothing, the idea of wearing the latest is something that's being pushed upon us because they need to have short life cycles. So, I mean, there's no problem in making clothes that's going to last you for more than a season. I mean, there's no problem at all. You can look at companies like Patagonia that make outerwear, or a Swedish company called Houdini Sportswear that's come really far with this as well. So it's kind of cool seeing how different companies kind of go in different directions. And this actually comes back again to size. H&M, you know, big company founded decades ago, and they're fundamentally trying to protect the business model that has served them so well, that solved the problem that was from the day when they were founded. And then you see these newer companies that are kind of pushing the boundaries, or at least smaller companies pushing the boundaries, and that are saying, we're going to change our model completely and try and do something different. And it's going to be interesting to see which way it goes and where consumers are going to go. Are they going to go with, you know, higher quality garments that will last you for longer, that are designed more neutrally, not to have to be changed? Or are they going to continue wanting to use, you know, kind of the latest, greatest, and hope that tech and innovation is going to save that particular brand of consumerism for them? I'm really looking forward to watching that cage match go down.
I really look at situations like this from kind of a Voltaire perspective, and I think like the world is free. We have free will. We're free to, you know, and you can question that because there's advertising and, you know, there's social paradigms and everything. But in end of the day, we live in the world which we have in essence created for ourselves. So if you want to distill the, you know, human nature, just look at the world we live in, because this is the world humans have created for themselves. And I think one fundamental need, which we seem to have, and which we can't seem to get rid of, and which I think sustainability in certain respects needs to address, is the desire for shiny new toys. Is this, you know, is this inherent propensity of humans to get tired of the things that we have and to want something new. To covet our neighbor's goods is natural and it's human, and it is something that they had to regulate in the Old Testament, you know. So it's been with us for a very long time. And so it's interesting to hear these examples where you can say, okay, well, maybe we can keep that business model alive and still cater to that part of the reptile brain, but remove the problematic part of short life cycles, which is the waste. Because if we can eliminate that, then there's no problem. We already see this with software. I mean, nobody's thinking about short life cycles when we think about Google Workspace, because the versions have a lifespan of a day or two these days, and nobody really thinks about it because they don't produce waste, so they don't figure in that conversation.
And I think that's I think that's kind of the end point that we're going to reach in this discussion. I think I think we all want to covet our neighbor's goods, and I think one takeaway that I want to leave anybody listening is that it served us so well. I mean, if we can harness that for good, it's built the modern economy. And the general idea behind that people want more is an incredibly powerful driver for people to, kind of challenge themselves and be better than they were yesterday. And I think that is one thing pushing humanity forward. And that's why I think it's important that sustainability doesn't become the enemy of product innovation rather than the friend. Because if we start saying we're going to save and we're not going to do this, we're not going to do that, then we're fundamentally taking away the innovative driver that's pushed society to the point where we are today. And I will have no part of that. I want us to continue being innovative.
100%. And I would like to say that basically, if we can harness this power to make sustainable products something which those who do not have them covet and want to own, then they can be the neighbor's goods that everybody else wants. And that can help us push sustainability out into society at large. So we should be using these forces to help and further our goals in the future.
I think that's the takeaway. So covet your neighbor's goods and be sustainable while doing it.
Yeah, make sure they're sustainable. Exactly.
Awesome, Andi. I've had a blast as always. Thank you so much. And for anybody
My
listening,
pleasure.
comment, like, subscribe, do your thing. And if you want us to cover a specific topic in the future, make sure to drop us a DM or send us a text or whatever. And surely we're gonna cover it sooner or later. Have a good one, everybody. Thanks.
Take care.